This week's topic in my strength and conditioning class is testing. And our textbook only includes performance testing, or what I would term performance testing, in its descriptions of testing. So to me, a performance test measures, an ability, vertical jump, a 1 rep squat test, wind gate, anaerobic test, something like this. And that's what the book really focuses on. But to me, before we do performance testing, we want to do some form of movement screen or movement assessment or movement competency exam, something that's going to tell me whether or not an athlete is prepared to do performance testing. So whether you use Kelvin Giles PCA or at the FMS or NASM, doing something to see can the athletes do the movements that are eventually going to be tested. The main movement screen that I use is a body weight squat or an overhead squat, with like a PVC pipe. And I just want to see, can players squat? Before we start to squat in a weight room or put weight on the back or anything like that, I want to make sure that they can squat. Based on my experience, I can see a lot of things out of a squat. And so as I was thinking about this and lecturing on it today, and then on my drive home, I listened to an old podcast with Kelly Starrett, and he was talking about how he lectured at the Stanford Medical School, and asked the doctors or the aspiring doctors, how many had a movement practice, and they all raised their hands, said they did, and so he asked one, and the guy says, "Yeah, I run," and so Starrett says, "That's exercise, bro," and got me thinking back to a couple episodes ago. I talked about listening to a Kelvin Giles podcast and how he was talking about the formative ages from 14 to 21 and how this is where we really need to be training, hard to prepare athletes for a higher level of competition, and using a long-term method of starting at the basics, starting with the movements early, 13, 14 years old, and then progressing and getting to where at 19, 20-year-old, we're really worried about the intensity, the volume, how basically the numbers, how much weight can we put up, how high can we jump, how fast can we run, things like that. But doing it with a progressive manner over a period of years and not trying to fit it into a 3-week training camp. And so as I thought about all these things, both, how the textbook completely ignored movement competency, in a strength and conditioning textbook, how a lot of strength and conditioning coaches ignore movement competency, Starrett's, kind of take on, movement and exercise being two different things, and then Giles talking about the long-term progressive training to prepare players for a higher level of competition, and the potential negative ramifications of not doing that, and potentially the injuries that could occur at higher levels of competition because we have essentially untrained players, regardless of how athletic they are. So again, if we're focusing only on performance measures, having a 35, 40-inch vertical jump suggests that one is a good athlete. But if we can't move correctly or move well, we may be predisposing that athlete to injury because they can produce a lot of power, produce a lot of force, jump really high. Therefore, they're landing and applying a lot of force on their landing. But if we don't move well, and don't know how to reduce that force or decelerate, that's the potential for an injury, whether it's a chronic or an acute injury. So thinking of all these things made me wonder how many coaches, strength and conditioning, basketball or otherwise, start off a season with doing some form of movement assessment, or are they simply focusing on the performance test or the exercise? Do they just go out and run, a lot of laps or run a lot of sprints and do a lot of jumping and maybe lift a lot of weights without focusing first on the movement? Can they perform these movements correctly, well, without compensation? Or are we just going straight into the exercise and we're just worried about getting fit and getting stronger and ignoring this movement competency? And potentially, if we are ignoring this movement competency and we're moving straight to the weight room, straight to sprints, change of directions, etc., is that a reason why we have injuries, both at that level, the immediate season, or as players progress and accumulate this training over years and years on a poor foundation because nobody's really assessed their movement or taught them how to move correctly. I thought back to when I presented at Boston Sports Performance and Medicine Group back, I think it was in 2009 when I presented there. And one of the things that motivated my presentation, which was watching a Division I strength and conditioning coach with a preseason basketball conditioning, running shuttles, change of directions, and the players all changed direction poorly, and there was no instruction, no feedback. They were exercising. They're seeing how fast they could run or how long they could run, but there was no attention to the quality of the movements. So the longer they ran and the worse their change of directions became, the worse off or the worse movement patterns they were developing. And at the time, I watched, one girl who was a really good athlete, could jump really high, was very strong on the basketball court, but I watched her do a single leg hop, and I immediately told the coach that, she was at risk for an ACL because she had poor movement control on landing. That as a fan sitting in the stands, I had never noticed during her first 2 years of basketball, but when I worked with her one-on-one, it was pretty easy to see that she just lacked the movement control and the motor control, and had all kinds of compensations and had joints going in just wrong ways, and so putting that into more volume and more stress as she develops more strength and power so she could jump even higher, and then having to land in that situation, to me she was at risk, and a year later or within the next year she tore her ACL. And so what was that strength coach doing through all those repetitions of sprints and jumps and lifting weights? Was there any attention to the movement competency? Now, I wasn't there for every session. I don't know. According to the players that I spoke to at the time, there really wasn't. It was more about putting out effort, getting faster numbers, getting higher numbers in the weight room. And that tends to be what strength coaches who I've been around tend to base their practice on. It's, can we reduce a 40 time? Can we increase a vertical jump? Can we put more weight on the back for a back squat? That means we're progressing. Regardless of whether or not we're having to compensate or we're doing so with poor movement habits or developing poor movement patterns that potentially could lead to, again, acute or chronic injury in the future. So, putting all these things together again, hopefully basketball coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, as the season begins now, fall training, off-season training, hopefully we're beginning with some form of movement assessment to see how well players move, and if there are problems, find a way to address them, whether that is internally or sending them externally. But if we don't move well, eventually there's going to be a problem, whether that problem becomes reduced performance or an injury. And so at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of a player's career, this is a time where we should focus on the basic movements, make sure we can do the basic movements correctly, and then once we know that, then we can get into the performance testing and see, what are our rate limiters and what type of exercises should we be prescribing based on what the athletes need in their sport and where they are as individual athletes. But first, we need to start with the movements to make sure that we can move forward.